The classroom was filled with the sound of chalk scratching against the blackboard and the low murmur of students shifting in their chairs. It was another ordinary evening at the small town's adult education center. People from different walks of life came here to learn. Some wanted to finish their basic schooling, others just wanted to improve skills they had missed in their younger years. The teacher, a man in his mid-40s with a sharp voice and a habit of making jokes to keep the students awake, was walking around the room with a confident smile. He was known for his good nature but also for teasing students when they least expected it. At the back of the room sat a woman who looked simple in every way. She wore a plain cotton dress, her hair tied back in a loose bun. Her hands carried the roughness of years of housework and farming. She was not like the younger students in the class, many of whom were eager to pass exams and move on to college. She came here quietly every day, sitting in the same chair, carefully listening to lessons, and slowly filling her notebook with neat handwriting. She never laughed too loud, never argued, never stood out. Most people thought of her as just a hard-working wife from the farming community who wanted to learn how to read better and maybe manage numbers for household work. No one looked at her twice. That evening, the teacher felt a bit mischievous. He had just finished explaining a complicated topic in calculus. Most of the students were staring blankly at the blackboard, struggling to understand. Some of them whispered to each other, some doodled in their books. He wanted to break the silence and add a little humor to the room. His eyes moved around the class until they landed on the quiet woman at the back. Something about her stillness made him think she would be the perfect target for his joke. He turned back to the blackboard and wrote down an equation that even the brightest students in the class found intimidating. Numbers, symbols, and letters stretched across the board in a way that looked more like a secret code than a math problem. Once he finished, he placed the chalk down with a flourish and looked at the class with a playful grin. "All right then," he said, his voice carrying a mix of challenge and amusement. "Who here thinks they can solve this?" The days continued to pass, and what had started as one surprising classroom moment grew into something much larger. The woman, once unnoticed and thought of as ordinary, had become the center of quiet admiration. People now whispered about her outside the classroom, telling others how she had solved a difficult problem that even young students could not attempt. Her neighbors, who had always thought of her only as a hard-working wife and mother, began to see her differently. Some came to her with small questions about money calculations or their children's homework, amazed at how patiently she explained things. The competition had been the beginning of a new chapter in her life, though she did not realize it at first. For many days afterward, people in the town continued to talk about her performance. Neighbors who once greeted her with casual smiles now stopped to ask her questions. Shopkeepers in the market nodded at her with respect. Some even told their children, "See, you should learn from her. She never gave up on knowledge." For a woman who had lived in the background of life for so long, this sudden attention felt strange. But it also felt beautiful. It was as if the world was finally seeing a part of her that had always been hidden. Her classmates treated her differently as well. They no longer saw her as just another student. To them, she was almost like a guide, someone who showed them that anything was possible with patience and effort. Even the youngest students, who once whispered jokes about her, now came to her with respect in their voices. "Can you help me?" they asked, handing her their notebooks. She always said yes, never refusing anyone. The teacher, too, could not hide his pride. One evening, as the class ended, he said, "You remind us all that knowledge does not have an age. You have shown what true learning looks like. I hope you never stop." His words touched her deeply. She had started this journey only to read better, to understand simple math for daily life. But now it had grown into something bigger than she had imagined. At home, the changes were even more powerful. Her children looked at her with shining eyes. They no longer saw her only as a mother who worked endlessly to keep the family together, but as someone extraordinary. One night, her eldest daughter hugged her tightly and said, "Mama, you inspire me." If you can study and succeed now, then I have no excuse to give up on my dreams." Those words filled her with warmth. She realized that her journey was not just for herself, it was planting seeds in the hearts of her children as well. Her husband, too, noticed the transformation. He watched quietly as she spent late nights reading by the lamp, her notebooks open on the table, her eyes filled with focus. He remembered the young girl he had married years ago, a girl full of promise, before responsibilities had weighed her down. Now he saw that same spark again. One evening, he said softly, "You have always been strong, but now you are shining in a way I have never seen before. I am proud of you." His support gave her even more courage. The principal of the center, impressed by her performance at the competition, suggested something unexpected. He told her that she should continue her education formally. At first, she was hesitant. She thought, "I am too old. My place is at home." But he encouraged her, saying, "Age does not decide talent. You have a gift, and the world needs to see it." Slowly, with the encouragement of her teacher, classmates, and family, she began to believe it might be possible. Weeks turned into months, and she prepared for examinations she had never thought she would face again. The nights were long, balancing her duties at home with her studies, but she never complained. Every page she read, every problem she solved, felt like reclaiming a piece of her lost self. She studied not just for herself but also for her children, to prove to them that dreams could survive any hardship. When the results came, she passed with high marks. Her children ran around the house cheering, her husband clapped her on the back, and even her neighbors congratulated her. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel proud openly. She smiled widely, holding her results in her hands, tears filling her eyes. She had done it not for recognition, but to prove that it was never too late. Her story began to inspire people beyond her small town. Other women, who had once thought education was out of their reach, started coming to the center. They pointed at her and said, "If she can do it, so can we." The classrooms grew fuller, the laughter louder, the spirit stronger. Without intending to, she had become a role model. The teacher often thought back to the day when he had first called her to the board as a joke. He admitted to himself, and later even to her, "That day I underestimated you. I thought it would be funny. But what you showed me changed not just my view of you, but my view of teaching itself. You reminded me never to judge anyone by their appearance or their silence." She smiled gently when he said that, replying only, "Sometimes life hides treasures in unexpected places." Years later, her journey carried her further than she had ever imagined. After completing her studies, she was offered a position to help at the same center where she had once been a student. At first, she doubted herself, but when she stood in front of a classroom for the first time, something felt right. She saw in the eyes of her students the same confusion, the same fear she had once felt. And she knew she could help them. She taught with patience, kindness, and clarity, just as she had done with her classmates years ago. Slowly, she became known not just as a student who had surprised everyone, but as a teacher who inspired many. Her children grew up with the memory of their mother studying late at night, refusing to give up. They carried that lesson into their own lives, chasing their dreams with determination. Her eldest daughter became a teacher too, often telling her students, "My mother showed me that learning never ends." Her son, inspired by her perseverance, studied engineering, saying proudly, "I got my love of numbers from her." The town itself remembered her story for years to come. Whenever new students entered the adult education center, teachers would tell them, "Once there was a woman here who everyone thought was just ordinary. But she solved a problem that shocked us all, and she changed the way we saw learning forever." Her name became a quiet legend, not for fame or money, but for proving a truth that touched everyone's heart, that talent, once planted, never truly dies. It only waits for the right moment to bloom again. Looking back, she often thought about that single day when the teacher had pointed at her as a joke. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a small classroom moment, meant to bring laughter. But that moment had unlocked everything. It had revealed her gift, reminded her of her dreams, and given her the courage to walk a path she thought was lost. Sometimes, she reflected, life's greatest changes begin not with grand plans, but with small, unexpected chances. Her journey ended not with applause or trophies but with something far more meaningful, a life of purpose, respect, and inspiration. She had gone from being invisible to unforgettable, from being underestimated to being honored. And all of it began because one day, in a small classroom, a teacher asked her to solve a problem as a joke. What happened next truly did blow everyone's mind, and it changed her life forever. Inside the classroom, her respect grew stronger each day. Whenever the teacher taught a new topic, students no longer looked only at him. Their eyes also turned toward her, as if to confirm that they had understood. Even the teacher began to rely on her, sometimes pausing in the middle of a lecture and asking her to add her explanation. She did so humbly, never seeking attention, but her presence brought a sense of calm to the class. The students trusted her words, and that trust changed the way they learned. One evening, the teacher brought another complex equation to the board. It was more difficult than usual, and he wanted to test the students. He asked for volunteers, but once again, silence filled the room. Everyone avoided eye contact, afraid of making mistakes. Then a student whispered, "Ask her again." The teacher smiled slightly, turned, and said, "Would you like to try?" She walked forward without hesitation this time, solving the problem with the same quiet confidence. When she finished, the students broke into applause, not forced, but genuine admiration. The sound filled the classroom, and though she blushed slightly, she smiled too, realizing that the world around her was beginning to change. The teacher grew more curious about her background. After class one evening, when the others had left, he asked her again, "Why did you stop studying?" She lowered her eyes and said softly, "Life took a different path. My family needed me, and books had to be put aside." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance. The teacher looked at her for a long time and then said, "But you haven't lost your gift. You still have it." His words stayed in her heart, giving her courage she didn't know she needed. Soon, her children noticed the difference as well. One day, her son brought home a math problem he could not solve. She looked at it carefully, then explained it step by step until he understood. His eyes widened with surprise. "Mama," he said, "you're better than my school teacher." She laughed at his innocent words, but inside she felt proud. For years, her children had only seen her as someone who cooked, cleaned, and worked endlessly. Now they were beginning to see another side of her, someone intelligent, someone strong in a way they had never imagined. Her eldest daughter, too, began asking for help with schoolwork. One evening, while they sat together at the wooden table, the daughter said, "I didn't know you loved math this much." The woman smiled gently and replied, "It was my first love, long ago." Her daughter looked at her with shining eyes and said, "Then maybe it can be your love again." Those words filled her with unexpected emotion. Could it really be possible to return to the dreams she had once lost? The respect she earned at the education center soon reached the larger town community. One day, the principal of the school visited the adult center. The teacher proudly told him the story of how the woman had solved the impossible problem. The principal was curious and asked her to demonstrate. Nervously, she stood at the board once again, solving the question he posed. When she finished, the principal nodded with deep respect and said, "You have a rare talent. You should not waste it." That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake on her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about those words. She had spent so many years believing her time had passed, that her role in life was fixed and unchangeable. But now, people were telling her she still had something valuable to offer. It was frightening, but also exciting. For the first time in years, she dared to imagine a different kind of future. Her classmates, once her equals, began to look at her almost like a mentor. They gathered around her during breaks, asking for help not only with math but with other problems too. She listened patiently, advising them when she could. Her calmness, her wisdom, and her kindness made her a figure of quiet guidance. Even those who had once mocked her now sought her advice, their earlier laughter replaced by admiration. The teacher noticed all of this and one evening announced, "I think we should try something different. From now on, I will ask her to help explain lessons as we go." Sometimes another voice, another way of seeing, makes learning easier. The students nodded eagerly. The woman, though shy at first, agreed. She did not think of herself as a teacher, but slowly, she began to play that role. She prepared small notes at home, revising old topics, so she could explain them more clearly to her classmates. She even stayed late after class sometimes, helping those who struggled. Her life became busier, balancing her household work with this new responsibility, but she felt alive in a way she had not in years. Her days had meaning beyond chores, they had purpose. Her family began to notice the light in her eyes. Her husband, who had always appreciated her hard work at home, now saw her in a new way. One evening, after watching her help their daughter with difficult problems, he said, "You have a gift. I never knew." She looked at him and replied softly, "I almost forgot it myself." He smiled and said, "Then don't forget again. Use it." Those words encouraged her more than he realized. The turning point came when the education center organized a small competition. Students from different classes were invited to solve problems and show their skills. The teacher, knowing her hidden talent, encouraged her to participate. At first, she resisted. "I am too old for this," she said. But the class insisted, telling her that she would inspire them all. Finally, she agreed. The day of the competition arrived. The hall was filled with people, students, teachers, and townsfolk who had come to watch. When her name was called, some people in the audience looked surprised. They whispered, "Why is she here? Isn't she just a housewife?" But those whispers faded when she stepped to the front, calm and steady. She faced the board with confidence and solved problem after problem with grace. By the time she finished, the judges and the audience were stunned. Applause filled the room, louder than she had ever heard in her life. That evening, as she walked home, her heart felt light. The town, her classmates, her family all had seen what she was capable of. But more importantly, she had seen it herself. She realized now that her life did not have to be limited to what had once been expected of her. She could dream again. She could achieve again. And nothing, not even lost years, could take away the knowledge she carried inside her. The students lowered their eyes quickly. No one dared to raise a hand. Everyone knew it was too hard. That was when the teacher chuckled and pointed straight at the quiet woman. The days that followed felt different inside the classroom. What had once been a quiet routine of lessons now carried a quiet excitement, all because of one unexpected moment. The story of how the woman had solved the teacher's difficult problem spread quickly, not only among the students but also among people outside. Some of the younger students told their families at dinner, and neighbors whispered about it in the local market. It was the kind of story small towns loved to pass around, a simple woman surprising everyone with hidden brilliance. Inside the classroom, the shift was even stronger. Students who had once overlooked her now paid attention whenever she spoke. The younger ones, who had laughed at her earlier, now found themselves curious about what else she might know. Even the teacher seemed to carry a new sense of respect, though he did not openly admit it. The woman herself tried to continue as she always had, sitting quietly in her usual place, listening carefully, and writing notes in her neat handwriting. But the air around her was no longer the same. One afternoon, the teacher introduced another problem to the class. It was not as complicated as the one she had solved earlier, but still challenging for the students. When he asked if anyone wanted to try, the usual silence filled the room. Then, almost without thinking, a student turned toward her and said softly, "Maybe she can show us." The room chuckled, not with mockery this time, but with genuine hope. The teacher looked at her as well, raising his eyebrows, waiting. She hesitated for a moment. She did not want to turn the class into a show. She did not enjoy standing out, but she also saw the expectant faces around her. Slowly, she rose from her seat once again. This time, the walk to the front felt less heavy. She picked up the chalk and began solving, speaking softly as she wrote. The steps were smooth, her explanation simple enough that even those who usually struggled could follow along. By the time she finished, the board was filled with a clear solution, and the class was nodding. Some even smiled with relief, happy that they had understood something that once felt impossible. She placed the chalk back down and returned to her seat. The teacher gave a small, approving nod, and for the first time he said, "That was well done. Thank you for sharing with the class." Her heart warmed at those words. She had not heard praise from a teacher in years, not since she was a teenager. For a moment, it was as if time had turned back, and she was once again that bright young girl who had loved mathematics more than anything else. That evening, she walked home with her head slightly higher than usual. The sun was setting over the fields, painting the sky in gold and orange. Her children ran to meet her at the door, their laughter filling the air. As she cooked dinner, she found herself smiling quietly, remembering the looks on her classmates' faces when they had finally understood her explanation. It felt good not just to solve the problem, but to help others understand it too. The next few weeks became a turning point. The teacher, who had once thought of her as an ordinary student, began to call on her more often. Sometimes it was to solve a problem, other times, it was to explain concepts in her own words after he had taught them. At first, she worried that the others might grow tired of her presence, but to her surprise, the opposite happened. The students began asking her for help outside of class. They would approach her during breaks, holding their notebooks, saying things like, "Can you show me how to do this step?" or "I didn't understand the homework, can you explain it again?" She helped them patiently, never showing frustration, always speaking in the same calm voice. She discovered that teaching others gave her joy, even more than solving the problems herself. It was as if she had been given a second chance, a chance to share the gift she had once thought was wasted. The teacher noticed this too. One day, after class, he pulled her aside. His tone was serious, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Where did you learn mathematics so well?" he asked. She looked down, unsure how to answer. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but then she spoke softly. "I loved it as a child. I studied hard, but life, it didn't allow me to continue." The teacher nodded slowly, his respect deepening. "Well," he said, "it seems you still carry that knowledge. And more importantly, you carry the patience to teach it. That's something even trained teachers struggle with." His words stayed with her long after she left the classroom that day. She thought about them while cooking, while cleaning, while walking through the market. Could it really be true? Could she still have something valuable to give, after all these years? She had spent so much of her life believing her chance had passed. Yet now, with every passing day, she felt as though a new path was opening before her. Of course, not everyone responded with excitement. Some students, especially the younger ones who struggled the most, felt embarrassed to be taught by someone they once considered less educated. One boy even muttered under his breath one evening, "She thinks she's a teacher now." But even he fell silent when she gently helped him with a problem he had been stuck on for days. Slowly, even the doubtful ones could not deny her skill. At home, her children began to notice changes too. Her eldest daughter, who often asked for help with schoolwork, was surprised to see her mother explain advanced concepts with ease. "Mama," she said one night, you know more than my math teacher." The woman laughed softly at the exaggeration, but inside her heart swelled with pride. For the first time, her children looked at her not just as their mother, but as someone brilliant, someone capable of more than they had imagined. The classroom continued to transform. Instead of dreading math lessons, the students looked forward to them. The teacher still led the class, but the woman's quiet presence had become a second pillar of learning. She did not try to take anyone's place, but simply offered her help whenever needed. Together, the teacher and the woman created an environment where students felt encouraged instead of afraid. One particular evening stood out. The teacher introduced a new concept that left the class scratching their heads. He explained it twice, but confusion still lingered. Finally, he looked at the woman and said, "Would you mind trying?" She walked to the board and began again, this time using small, everyday examples: fruits, coins, and even stories of farm chores. The students' eyes lit up with understanding. By the end, they were nodding, smiling, even clapping softly. The teacher himself smiled, shaking his head. "I don't think I could have explained it better myself," he admitted. That night, the woman sat awake for a long time. She thought about the road that had brought her here, the years of silence, the sacrifices, the buried dreams. And now, here she was, rediscovering herself in a classroom where she had expected nothing more than basic lessons. Life had played a strange trick by trying to laugh at her. The teacher had unlocked a hidden part of her soul. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to imagine. What if she finished her studies properly? What if she continued learning? What if she, too, could one day stand in front of a classroom not as a student, but as a teacher? The thought frightened her, but it also filled her with a kind of hope she had not felt in decades. "You there," he said, smiling widely. "Why don't you give it a try? Let's see what you've got." The classroom remained silent long after the woman had returned to her seat. It was as if time had stopped and nobody quite knew how to react. The chalk dust was still floating lightly in the air near the board where she had worked, and the neat solution she left behind stood like proof that what had just happened was not a dream. The students shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other in disbelief, while others just sat frozen, staring at her back. The teacher, who had started the moment as a playful joke, was perhaps the most surprised of them all. His smile had disappeared completely, and instead his face carried the expression of someone who had seen something rare. He kept glancing at the equation, then at her, then back at the board. He almost wanted to erase it to test her again, but even his own professional pride stopped him. She had not only solved the problem but had done it in a way that showed deep understanding. It wasn't luck. It wasn't guesswork. It was knowledge. The woman herself, however, looked unchanged. She sat with her hands folded on her notebook, her face calm and eyes lowered, as if nothing remarkable had happened. She had no prideful smile, no demand for recognition. It was as though she had simply done what came naturally to her, something as ordinary as washing vegetables or sweeping the floor. But in the minds of those around her, she had transformed. A young man sitting 2 rows ahead leaned back and whispered to his friend, "Did you see that?" She didn't even hesitate. His friend nodded slowly, still staring at her with new eyes. "I thought she didn't know anything beyond basic sums," he muttered. A girl in the front row, who often scored high in math, chewed on her pencil nervously. She had struggled with that very topic just the week before, and here was a woman everyone called simple, solving it with ease. The teacher finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Well," he said softly, "that was unexpected." His tone carried more respect than humor this time. The students straightened in their chairs, waiting for him to continue. He looked at the woman and said, "You seem to have some experience with mathematics." The woman only gave a small nod, not eager to explain herself. She wasn't someone who liked to talk about her past. But her silence made the curiosity in the room grow stronger. Whispers started again. Who was she really? Where had she learned such skills? Why had she kept it hidden all this time? The truth, known only to her, was that mathematics had once been her passion. As a teenager, she had loved numbers the way others loved stories or songs. Her father used to joke that she could count grains of rice just by looking at a bowl. Teachers praised her as a prodigy. There was even talk once that she might go to a big university in the city. But life had not gone as planned. When her family's finances collapsed and her mother fell sick, she had been forced to abandon her studies. Instead of classrooms and textbooks, her world became cooking fires, farm fields, and long hours of labor. Dreams faded quietly while responsibilities grew. Now, years later, sitting in this class, she had come only with the hope of brushing up on her reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. She wanted to help her children with their homework, to be able to read bills, and to feel less dependent when managing household accounts. Never had she thought she would face calculus again. Yet, in that moment when the teacher had called her up, something deep inside her had woken up, as if reminding her that her old self still lived quietly within. The teacher, still unsettled by what he had seen, decided to test her gently. "Would you like to explain to the class how you solved it?" he asked. He expected her to decline, but to his surprise, she rose again. She walked back to the board with the same calm steps, picked up the chalk, and this time began speaking. Her voice was soft but steady. She explained each line of the solution in simple words, breaking down the problem as though she was teaching a child. The class listened with rapt attention. They could see now that she was not reciting something memorized, she truly understood. She used small examples, like comparing variables to apples and oranges, making it easier for the others to follow. For the first time that evening, students who had always struggled with calculus found themselves nodding, as if the fog in their minds was beginning to clear. The teacher himself leaned against his desk, arms crossed, studying her carefully. It wasn't only her knowledge that impressed him, but her patience, her ability to explain. She had the natural quality of a teacher, though she stood there humbly, unaware of the effect she was having on her audience. When she finished, she quietly put the chalk down again and went back to her seat. This time, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't disbelief, it was respect. The students didn't laugh anymore. They looked at her as though she had suddenly grown taller, as though she carried a weight of wisdom that none of them had noticed before. Even those who had mocked her simplicity now lowered their eyes when she passed them a faint smile. At home that night, as she sat by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, helping her youngest child read through a textbook, her thoughts returned to the moment in class. She had not planned it, but the old spark inside her had felt alive again. She remembered the excitement of solving problems, the joy of patterns, the beauty in logic. For years she had buried it under duties and chores, telling herself it was part of the past. But maybe, just maybe, it was still part of her future. The next day at the center, the atmosphere in the classroom was different. When she entered, people greeted her with warm nods instead of ignoring her presence. The young man who usually teased her about being slow in reading offered to share his book with her. The girl in the front row even turned around and whispered, "Can you help me with last night's homework? I couldn't figure it out." For the first time, the woman realized that she was being looked at not with pity or indifference, but with admiration. The teacher, too, behaved differently. He no longer made casual jokes at her expense. Instead, he began asking her small questions in class, almost testing how far her knowledge went. Each time, she answered with quiet confidence, and each time the respect in his eyes grew stronger. Slowly, her presence began to change the mood of the classroom. The students, inspired by her calm brilliance, started working harder. They no longer complained about difficult exercises, because if she could handle them after years away from study, then surely they could too. She became, without even trying, an example of determination and hidden strength. And yet, she remained the same in her heart. She didn't boast about what she knew. She didn't remind others of her talent. She continued to take notes carefully, help her classmates, and return home to cook dinner for her family. But deep down, a seed had been planted again, the seed of her old dreams, the spark that life had once forced her to put away. The room erupted in soft laughter. Some students covered their mouths to hide their giggles. Others leaned forward, waiting to see her reaction. Everyone thought it was a harmless joke, a way to lighten the moment. After all, how could a simple woman who barely spoke in class even begin to solve something so complicated? The woman looked up slowly. For a moment, her eyes met the teacher's, and then she looked at the long equation on the board. There was no anger on her face, no embarrassment. She simply stared at it as if her mind was already working. The laughter around her grew softer, unsure now. She stood up quietly, her movements calm, and began walking toward the front of the room. Her steps echoed faintly in the silence. The teacher blinked in surprise. He had expected her to laugh nervously or shake her head. Instead, she picked up the piece of chalk with steady fingers. She looked at the board again, and for the first time in years, something inside her sparked alive. It was like a hidden door had opened in her memory, letting in light she had forgotten was even there. She remembered being a young girl sitting at her school desk many years ago, when numbers had felt like old friends, when solving a problem gave her joy the way music gives joy to a singer. Back then, teachers praised her, and classmates envied her quick mind. But life had taken a different turn. Family needs, financial struggles, and the responsibilities of marriage had pushed her away from her books. She had packed her notebooks away, replacing them with cooking pots, laundry, and endless chores. The world had forgotten her talent, and slowly, she too had buried it. Now, with the chalk in her hand, those memories came rushing back like a wave. She stood in front of the blackboard while the entire class watched in stunned silence. Her heart was steady. She did not hear the whispers or see the doubtful eyes. All she saw was the equation in front of her, and deep inside, she knew what to do. One of the students in the front row leaned toward another and whispered, "She won't even know where to start." The other nodded, expecting the same. But to their shock, the woman placed the chalk on the board and began writing. At first, she moved slowly, carefully forming each number and symbol, making sure her steps were clear. Her voice did not speak, but her actions spoke louder than any words. The laughter that had started as a joke faded completely. Every eye in the room followed her chalk as it moved across the black surface. Line by line, she began solving the problem in a methodical way, as if she had been doing this every day of her life. The teacher, still standing at the side, tilted his head. His grin disappeared, replaced by a look of genuine interest. He crossed his arms, watching closely. Could she actually know what she was doing? That thought had not even occurred to him when he called her up. Minutes passed, but to the students it felt like seconds. The board was no longer filled with confusing symbols but with a clear sequence of steps, each one flowing into the next. She paused briefly, her brow furrowed in thought, then nodded to herself and continued. The chalk tapped firmly against the board, leaving behind answers that even the brightest in the room had not considered. By the time she neared the end, the silence in the classroom was so heavy it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. All that existed was the quiet sound of chalk and the steady breathing of a woman who had once been underestimated by everyone. Finally, she placed the chalk down on the holder. She stepped back, looking at the board one last time. Her hands, rough from years of housework, had just solved something that most of the students thought was impossible. She turned around, her expression calm, and simply said, "That should be the answer." The class froze. The teacher blinked several times, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. Without a word, he walked to the board, checking each step carefully. His eyes grew wider with every line he examined. Then he stopped at the final solution, his mouth parting slightly. It was correct. Every single step was flawless. A ripple of shock moved through the class. Students who had been smiling minutes ago now sat with open mouths. Someone whispered, "No way." Another muttered, "She actually solved it." Even those who had laughed the loudest earlier now looked down in embarrassment. The teacher turned back toward her, his face filled with astonishment. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. This woman, who had been the quietest in the room, who had been chosen for a harmless joke, had just proven herself in a way that none of them had expected. The woman did not smile or boast. She simply walked back to her seat, sat down quietly, and picked up her notebook again, as if nothing unusual had happened. But to everyone else in the room, everything had changed.